Hello, everyone.
Blog Talk Radio.
Hello, everyone. I want to welcome all of you back to Ohio Exopolitics. I'm your host, Mark Snyder. We are studying the Billy Meyer case today. I'm going to start out after the fall of Atlantis and Lemuria and then pick up in the Goblet of Truth. There's an interesting intersection between these two Meyer writings. We saw the fall of this really highly developed civilization in Atlantis and Lemuria. It reminds me, I did do a show with Solaris Blue Raven. If you search a little on YouTube, you could probably find the show. It was a 2-hour program. We talked about the fall and the rise, the fall of Atlantis and Lemuria, and even the rise of Atlantis and Lemuria. And we talked overall about just the big picture in the Meyer case as well. And I covered some things in the Goblet of Truth. I do have a link to that on the Exopolitics Ohio.us site. You'll have to search for it. I probably should put it on the main page. It's, I think, under the various topics page. And it's hidden in one of those tabs that says mark on other programs. So anyway, you can find that. I probably need to make that a little more accessible. Anyway, after the fall of Atlantis and Lemuria, there were 3 peoples that still existed on the earth. The one earth people consisted of the very distant descendants of the Armis people who had lived there where today the region of Armenia is. Now, Armenia is a mountainous country that is south of Russia, east of Turkey, west of Iran. And the distant descendants of this Ishwish, Armoris, settled there 133,000 years ago, and they survived this great disaster. The second people that survived the fall of Atlantis and Lemuria were under Jehovah's control. Jehovah was one of the kings of wisdom that were in the line of the Giza intelligences. And it says in the Meyer material that they were the descendants of the Aryans, which is quite intriguing. I did a little research on the Aryans, and of course, we're familiar with the master race ideal that engendered both the Aryanization programs in Nazi Germany. See, the Nazis believed that the Nordic peoples were Germanic peoples, and they represented an ideal and pure race. That was the purest representation of the original racial stocks, who sometimes call themselves the Proto-Aryans. So at least the Meyer material uses this word Aryan as the distant descendants of the Aryans, these people who were still around here, this second Earth people after the fall of Atlantis and Lemuria, and they had mingled themselves with the very underdeveloped earthly and lethargic native population. Remember, there were native Earth people, I think, with darker skin, typically. Sometimes they were called the Evas. So these descendants of the Aryans intermingled with what is called here the pure earthly and lethargic native populations. And this happened after the Sumerians were expelled. But this concept of the Aryans also goes into the Sanskrit and the related Indic languages. Arya means one who does noble deeds, a noble one. The term Arya is used 36 times in 34 hymns in the Rig Veda. So there's this concept of the Aryans in these old Indian Sanskrit writings One is the Rig Veda. The other one is called the Purists. So, and also, there's a concept called Arya in Buddhism, which is a signification of honor. So, whoever the original Aryans were, I'm not sure. It doesn't really elaborate here in the Maya material. But my sense is they must have been a very special people. But then they got mixed in with the native Earth people. Now, the third people on Earth after the fall of Atlantis were not really a people. They were a group of gypsies. And again, they were interspersed with Jehovah's spies and saboteurs. And it says here that they brought about dissension everywhere, greedily drawing everything to themselves, and were always constantly eager to murder, burn, and rob, for which reason they were named the Hebrons by the original language of our forefathers, it says here. And therefore Hebron later became Hebrons, and I assume that still later became Hebrews. In the Maya material says that these people have stirred up trouble, and the earth, it says, will first finally be calm when this power-hungry and bloodthirsty Hebron alliance splits into various. It's currently split into various sects, and it's dedicated to world control, so it's still here. So maybe that's one part of the elite that still exists. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole lineage of the Giza intelligence again, but we will talk about that, I'm sure, in the future at some point. But the Giza intelligences were headquartered far below the Giza Plateau, and they used religion to try to gain control of the people of the earth. And I think the final leader mentioned here is Kamagal II, which I think he died in 1976. And the Giza intelligences have since then been destroyed. First they were moved off the earth and then finally destroyed. Now I just noticed here later in Contact 70, it does mention more about what's called the Great Aryans, which was a group of 160,000 humans who advocated the ideas of Eris the First. And my understanding is Eris the First is Eris the Barbarian, the individual that came to the earth from Beta Centauri, took over Hyperborea. His son took over India and Pakistan. And those were the two leaders who stirred up all the trouble that led to the downfall of Atlantis. So this is the history that's not taught in our history books. The history that probably would enhance the understanding of the world in untold ways. And unfortunately, much of this history has not been translated yet and still remains in the German language, which is a bit of a frustration for me because I can't imagine myself finding the time to translate. But maybe that is in my future somewhere, I don't know. But then, again, it talks about the Great Aryans here, and this is near the end of Contact Report 70. It says, but then came the Great Aryans who moved between the Caspian Sea and Ararat and took possession of the clay brick towns of the mixed people, which had reached a good level of prosperity as a result of the earlier invading Aryans and returning descendants of the Sumerians. And it goes on here and says, and exactly this world was attacked and forced into bondage and transformed and pressed into a new state structure by the Aryans, who, deprived of all technology, had been wandering for long years, coming from the far north. Deprived of all technology by Jehav's Myrmidons, the Aryans settled down in the distant lands, but in time became stunted and mixed with the natives, and they soon lost all knowledge and ability of a higher level, and they lost the memory of their origin, which disappeared into the darkness of the forgetfulness. Well, this is quite interesting because evidently there is something to the story of the Aryans. And I think that's interesting that Hitler and the Nazis were trying to find the Aryans, find out information about the Aryans, who they thought were the superior master race. Now, I don't know that I'd go that far, but it does sound like they were the second people still here on the earth after the fall of Atlantis and Lemuria. Very interesting stuff here. But I want to snap back into the future, into the present, and step out of the past just a little bit and pick back up in the Goblet of Truth. Which I think has much to teach us. And I love the passage that's entitled What the Truth Knows to Say, which talks about how it's necessary for us to have respect or venerability towards the entirety of nature and towards the creation and the laws and recommendations of the creation. Now, respect means to have a deep feeling or admiration for something. Venerability means appreciation for the great age or the impressive dignity of something. And it goes on here to say, rivers, stones, plants, the air and water, bushes, trees, everything that crawls and flies on the earth is a life form with a spirit form, and these spirit forms are on a journey through time which involves many, many lifetimes. And that many of these creatures are connected by psychic swinging waves. And it mentions that these creatures are Weissenheiten. Now, typically in the Maya material, when it talks about Weissenheiten, we are talking about things like air and water, which actually are said to have a spirit form, believe it or not. The Maya material talks about the universal consciousness as being a Weissenheiten, meaning it has no personality. It's a superintelligence, but it's not anthropomorphic in any way. It builds universes as a part of its own evolution. So it evolves. Now, the Maya material talks about this tightly woven web of life. It says this is the basis for the tightly woven and indissoluble web of all life. And in this wise, no life form strives to rise up above others within their group and to set themselves up above others, because each life form contains a basic goodness and not evil. You notice it uses the word tightly woven, and nature is tightly woven, interlaced, like a fabric, and the pieces of the fabric are sent to go one over the other. It also says indissoluble, which has meanings like firm and stable. So nature, when we don't tamper with it, is a firm and stable type thing. The Maya material in the Goblet of Truth warns us that our society is becoming an aberration. And the reason it's an aberration is because we've gone down a wrong path of evolution. And now our society has influence from fanatical religions, sects, stubborn nationalism, fascism, might-greedy politics, terrorism, and neo-capitalism. All of these directions are aberrations of the negative and evil. And it says this all represents a threat to earthly humanity. We're heading towards this catastrophe that's talked about in the Goblet of Truth. A catastrophe is an extremely large-scale disaster. Now, it also mentioned fanatics here, fanatic religion. A fanatic often has a very intense, uncritical devotion. In many of the religions today, we see this very intense, uncritical devotion. One of the practices in very extreme forms of Islam is called female genital mutilation, where they actually cut out the clitoris and part of the vagina of young girls. I think that would probably fall under the fanatical religions. But we also have cynical materialism and neo-capitalism. Cynics are people motivated by self-interest, distrustful of human sincerity and integrity. And materialism is the tendency to consider material possessions and physical comfort as more important than spiritual values. So the Meyer material says, because of our disconnection with real spiritual values, because we've been influenced by fanatical religions and other philosophies, sectarian philosophies, autocratic philosophies, because we've become so materialistic that a clash of an industrial nations will occur, could occur, and this leads possibly to a third global conflagration. Now, the Enoch prophecies talk about a possible third global conflagration. And ironically, conflagration is a term that can mean a very large destructive fire, but it can also mean war or conflict. And in the Enoch prophecies, it says that in the third millennium, the greatest disaster will occur when nuclear biological weapons are released by automated system of human control. Now that's still prophecy. That doesn't have to happen. But the Goblet of Truth says that we're standing at the time just before the third global conflagration. And industrial nations, again, are the nations which process raw materials and manufacture goods in things called factories. Let me read on here. It says, indeed, the human beings of Earth are well on their way to this. Therefore, it is only a question of time and rationality as when and where and whether it will actually occur. However, it once again the case that the signs are pointing to the whole thing being unavoidable. However, this third world conflagration may take various forms, such as the collapse of nature, which has been desecrated and flouted by the human beings of Earth. Now, the word collapse means to break down, to come to nothing. Nature refers to the elements of the natural world, such as mountains, trees, animals, or rivers. And it says that nature has been desecrated, which has almost a religious connotation, a sacrilege to it. And some of the synonyms to desecration would be defile, violated, dishonored, polluted. happens, we could regress the harshest forms of primitive living. And the Meyer and the Goblet are about the ability of our getting back into a state of almost vegetative existence. Apocalypse, which can have two meanings. It talks of there's apocalyptic religious writings, but there's also the meaning of a universal or widespread disaster. The German word Asartung is used to describe the people at this time, which means to get very out of control of the good human nature. And this is also a time of machinations by politicians, crafty schemes, intrigues. So we've seen the fall of Atlantis and Lemuria. Well, what rose up after that fall was the Roman Empire. And it says here in the Goblet of Truth that in the Christian world, the blame for this undoubtedly lies fairly and squarely at the door of the Roman Catholic Church. Christianity is a monotheistic and strictly autocratically oriented religion. So the Roman Catholic Church, again, is the Christian church where it resides. It has quarters in the Vatican, sometimes called the Church. There's a hierarchy to the Church with bishops, priests, the Pope at the top, venerate saints, Mother Mary, autocratic like an autocrat, very terrible, despotic, domineering. So this Roman Catholic Church is very domineering, just as the Roman Empire. They're created as a conscious tyranny. And this has had such a profound effect on us for such a long time. I don't think we can really appreciate what has happened to us. And it has created a narrow-mindedness in the people of the earth that has made us enslaved for quite some time. Now, and because of this tyranny instituted by the Roman Empire and the Roman Catholic Church, certain things happened historically, like the Spanish Inquisition. An inquisition is an official investigation. So they were out trying to find the people that weren't following the dogmas of the Catholic Church. And when they found them, they did certain things like the auto de fe, where they condemned heretics, they burned them at the stake. Almost 32,000 people were burned at the stake because of this consciousness-conditioned tyranny. Consciousness is the state of being awake and aware of surroundings. Can bring something into the desire for use. Cruel, unreasonable, and arbitrary use of power and control. Let me pick up and read a little here in the true Christianity and all other religions. And there's absolute service reigns to regard the obligation of believing fallacious religious and sectarian teaching. Therefore, no conscious-based liberty is tolerated. So that's the whole point of the Roman Imperium and this intense Roman Catholic Church, was to stop all consciousness-based liberty and to put people into a state of servitude. Servitude is the state of being a slave or completely subject to someone more powerful. The word fallacious means to be based on a mistaken belief. Sectarian means narrowly confined or limited in interest, purpose, and scope. So all of the doctrines of the Roman Empire and the Catholic Church were designed to create like a mind prison for you. And once you get people in the mind prison, you don't have to worry about them being in a physical prison, because they'll only really do what's told in that case. Now, in the third millennium, is the millennium that we're entering, this 1,000 years that we're entering. Remember Billy's first contacts with an extraterrestrial man named Svoth? And Svoth said that the third millennium will start when we drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in the third millennium, our leaders will become megalomaniacal. They will take away our rights of self-determination. And we've seen that. We've seen our gun control go away. Our gun control increase, our right to bear arms go away. Our freedom of speech is being eroded by concepts like political correctness. Everyone has to be politically correct. You can't tell the truth anymore. Now, the problem is the people are also becoming indolent, obtuse, and indifferent, and this whole situation is creating the breeding ground for anger. And the reason people are angry just dawned on me today. It's in part because of the indifference, but it's also because of this. See, what is happening is maliciousness and confusion is slowly spreading over the earth. People can sense this pressure subconsciously as this whole system is eroding and falling down. They can see the natural world being destroyed. They can see overpopulation crowding them. And it's producing a kind of cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive dissonance is when you have two ideas that exist at the same time, and they're in conflict, and you believe them both. And you think they're both values, so you have a war going on in your mind, and you're trying to resolve this because you have these two ideas that don't seem to agree. Let me give you a quick example. I have a good, honest government, and yet you see these historical trends taking place, so you feel this inner conflict. Now I want to play a clip that talks about cognitive dissonance, and it does it in terms, well, I'll just let the clip explain it. But I think one of the things we're experiencing in the third millennium is this strange cognitive dissonance. I think this is, yes, we're ready to go.
Good. Okay, so back in the early 90s, I was a trainee commercial pilot with hair that probably produced more lift than most of the small aircraft I flew. Anyway, one day my instructor Bob came out and he said, "Ash, today I'm going to instruct you in instrument flying." Now this was pretty exciting because there's two flavours of flying. There's visual, where you can see the horizon ahead of you and what's below you, which is kind of for the rookie pilots and weekend pilots. Then there's instrument flying. Instrument flying is for the professionals. That's being able to punch into the clouds. So I was pretty excited about this. Anyway, we went out, we did our pre-flight briefing, and grabbed a little Cessna 152, took off, went out to the southern training area, got set up at 5,000 feet, and Bob whacked this on me. This little contraption, plastic contraption, is known as the hood, and it constrains the pilot's view to their 6 instruments. Bob said, "Okay, now I want you to fly straight and level just by instruments." I did that. It was pretty easy. I was pretty good at this stuff. Then he said, "Okay, you did well, Ash. I want you to maintain 5,000 feet and perform a standard rate turn. Now, this was a bit more difficult. I had to organise to work the pedals and the controls at the same time as scanning all these instruments without the wealth of information from the visual sphere outside. But I got it. I was pretty good. I was feeling pretty cocky. And he said, okay, done well, roll out of that into straight and level again. So I rolled out into straight and level. But my artificial horizon wasn't quite right. It was a bit off. So I looked over at my turn and slip indicator and the ball was out a bit, so I kicked in a bit of rudder. My directional gyro started moving. I was flying straight and level, but my instruments were failing. The altimeter started rising. The directional gyro was spinning faster. The artificial horizon just slipped right off the whole dial, and Bob whipped my hood off. I'd entered what is known as the graveyard spiral. Now, in a recent study, the average pilot with no instrument flight training, punching into clouds, lasted a mere 178 seconds. That's 2 seconds shy of 3 minutes before spiralling to their death. Fair enough. My vestibular senses had tricked me. The sense that tells me which way is up had tricked me, and Bob got me good with it. Bob taught me a good lesson. Next time I'd know, trust the instruments. So we went up for the next lesson, and I failed. And the next lesson, and the next lesson. This was frustrating me. I considered myself a good, competent pilot. Yet I couldn't accept the evidence in front of me. My intuition took over every time. My brain kept on making up these excuses. Oh, this aircraft has a dodgy vacuum pump. The static intakes on these little Tomahawks always blocks up. The instruments are failing. I knew the instruments were failing, but I couldn't seem to accept it. It's amazing. We're often taught or told how wonderful and powerful the 100 billion or so neurons that make up our mind are. Yet we rarely discuss the cognitive shortcomings that we have. I mean, at school I was taught how the mind works. It's very much like a modern laptop computer. You know, you have your high-definition video camera and your mic that takes in everything around you. You've got everything then stored to memory, bit for bit, perfectly written to data on your hard drive. And our brains process things in a very logical fashion, like we should all have Intel Inside stickers on our foreheads. This is the metaphor that's used, but it's not a very good metaphor. In fact, it's completely wrong. You see, our senses aren't like high-def recording equipment. We only take in snippets of information, and our mind fills in the gaps for us. As a pilot, we're taught a whole lot of tips and tricks to get around human limitations. Things like when we want to find an aircraft in the sky, we've got to break it up into quadrants. You see, our eyes only see this much clearly at any one time. It's hard to grasp, but this is what we see. Our eyes dart around at 1,000 degrees a second, what's called a saccade. Our mind fills in the rest of the picture with what it expects to see there. So if you're looking up at the sky, it expects to see a lot of blue. You have to actually break up the sky into quadrants and saccade across until the aircraft lands within the focus of those saccades before you'll see the aircraft. And it's not just our visual senses that work like this. All of our senses work like this. Our mind just fills in the gaps for us without us being aware of it. That's why illusions work. That's why Simon takes great delight in knowing how your perception works and being able to fool you, being able to manipulate that. And up here, it doesn't take in everything. It doesn't store everything to memory. It takes snippets, little grabs of feelings, of sight, sounds, taste, smells, emotions. And then it pieces them together when you recall a memory. When it pieces them together, it makes up the bits in between again. It creates a movie. Only the movie is based on a true story. The next time you recall that same event, you're recalling it from that memory, taking snippets of that memory and piecing it together again. So the next time, it's actually more like a screenplay based on a book, based on a true story. Each time you remember something, it changes a bit more. It takes one more step away from reality, even if it feels like you remember it clear as day. And our cognitions, the way we think, they're adapted. We evolved to be really good at surviving in small social groups, for being able to match patterns, for being able to keep track of social relationships. Not very good at logic, though. That horrible feeling I experienced when I couldn't get my instinct to match up with the evidence in front of me, that's known as cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive dissonance is when your mind tries to hold two conflicting ideas simultaneously. It gives you a horrible feeling. It'll be a negative feeling. It'll be feeling sick. It'll be feeling anxious or even angry. Cognitive dissonance is the mechanism by which we start to being able to, account for irrational behaviours like smoking. I've got a friend, Janine, very warm, intelligent lady. She's very smart. She works as an intensive care nurse. Every day she's looking after people with throat cancer and lung cancer who are dying from smoking. She knows the damage that it causes, yet she smokes. I asked her why, and she sat me down and said, Ash, I need to explain this to you. I'm a nurse. I work long, irregular hours. I don't get to exercise. I don't get to eat well. Smoking helps me keep down my weight. You think there's problems with people who have smoked for a long time. You should see the long-term problems of obesity. So just like that, she'd rationalised away her behaviour with her knowledge. And cognitive dissonance does this in a number of ways. Also, it's a great protector of our self-concept. What we think of as, I'm a good, moral, intelligent person. That self-concept, it protects it for us. This guy will never admit that he was wrong about invading Iraq. Not because he's evil, it's because he really thinks he wasn't wrong about invading Iraq. He thinks of himself as a good moral Christian. He was President of the United States. He was leader of the free world. He was the good guys. Unfortunately, he also set up the perfect context for making bad decisions. You see, George Bush was well known to fire or demote anyone who disagreed with his opinions.
So in the third millennium, we're going to feel more and more cognitive dissonance as the organizations that we have known and trusted, like our government, starts to break down, as we start to see anarchy in the streets, like in Ferguson, Missouri, as we start to see police brutality, as we see our religions crumble. We're going to see all of society go into this. So we're going to have to learn to be able to deal with this cognitive dissonance. One of the ways to deal with this cognitive dissonance is through meditation. Now, we're not going to cover meditation tonight. I just want us to get familiar with what this concept is, cognitive dissonance.
The individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous he cannot believe it exists. The American mind simply has not come to the realization of evil which has been introduced into our midst. J. Edgar Hoover. Cognitive dissonance is an uncomfortable feeling by holding two contradictory ideas simultaneously. This usually manifests itself in the difference between how we think we should act and how we actually act. The person that goes to church and does all the prayers and sings the songs the loudest might think of themselves as a good and holy person, but after church, if they get in the car and yell and slap their kids, there would clearly be a dissonance between how they think they are and what they are. This will result in an uncomfortable feeling called cognitive dissonance. The typical Republican is pro-life and talks about the sanctity of life, and yet usually there are the ones that support the war machine that spreads death throughout the world. The typical Democrat opposes war and talks about how innocent civilians are lost in barbaric wars, and yet they are also the same people that support abortion. Both of these groups hold contradictory ideas as truths that they feel are worth fighting for. If life is truly sacred and needs to be protected, then Republicans should be pro-life and anti-war. If humans have the right to kill each other and impose their will upon others, then abortion and war are one and the same. The result is that we have millions of people holding these contradictory ideas, and yet, if they really thought about it, they would not be able to move on. We see this in every election cycle when we think that there's somehow a difference between the Democrats and the Republicans, when every single fact points to the stark realization that there is no difference between the two parties on the most important issues. More debt is created by a privately held central bank to fund more spending, to create more wars, to secure more resources, to create larger corporate profits, to ship more jobs overseas, to destroy the middle class, to create a police state, to control the whole game. Nothing in my lifetime, no matter who has been in the White House or Congress, has ever challenged the way our paradigm operates, and yet we still feel some need to vote. The foundation of all mental illness is an unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering. Carl Jung. People are predisposed to thinking that they are correct, despite evidence to the contrary. If a kid fails a test, he might say to himself that he's smart, and he'll justify it by saying that he's just not a good test taker, or the teacher didn't like him. People who smoke might think of themselves as a smart person that makes good decisions, and yet they're actively increasing the risk of getting lung cancer. Dissonance is also magnified by how much that person suffered to attain that idea, or how much he is personally invested in that belief. A singer tries out for American Idol and is laughed out of the audition for singing horribly, will leave the audition and most likely blame the judges, or their choice in music, or that they didn't get enough rest. Anything except the uncomfortable idea that they are in fact a horrible singer, and that they wasted so much time and energy on something that they believed in so much was ultimately false. Military men are just dumb, stupid animals to be used as pawns in foreign policy. Henry Kissinger. Marines created dissonance when they suffer to go through boot camp. They overlook the fact that they are stripped of their individuality, trained to sacrifice themselves at the instant obedience of their commanders, live lives of poverty that are extremely hard on families, and that a folded flag is somehow worth their kid not having a father. Few Marines ever stop to see that they're not fighting to spread freedom. They are fighting for corporate interests by stealing the natural resources of other nations. General Smedley Butler was one of the most decorated Marines in history. He fought through his dissidence, not by justifying his actions. He did not try to convince others that being a Marine was worth the sacrifice. He fought through the dissidence by admitting to himself and the world, quote, "I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. Looking back at it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do is operate his racket in 3 districts. I operated on 3 continents. If we were merely dealing with the law of averages, half of the events affecting our nation's well-being should be good for America. If we were dealing with mere incompetence, our leaders should occasionally make a mistake in our favor. We are not dealing with coincidence or stupidity, but with planning and brilliance." Gary Allen. If someone has their entire existence tied to an idea or a job, the cognitive dissonance grows stronger. Take for an example a banker. They are more apt to justify the debt enslavement of their neighbors in numerous ways, rather than seeing that they're actively enslaving another human being. Rare is the man who sees the true cost of their actions and quits doing it. It is infinitely easier to create justifications than stop the actions that cause the dissonance. Noticing a contradiction in ideas will lead to dissonance, and this can be experienced as anxiety, guilt, shame, anger, embarrassment, and stress. When people are confronted with the conflict cognitive dissonance produces, they must resolve the conflict in order for that person to move on.
So we're going to have to learn to control our thoughts, especially in the 3rd millennium. We're going to have to try to avoid cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance will happen. We have to be able to analyze our thoughts, to evaluate our thoughts, and then switch back to a neutral, positive kind of thinking. Remember the book called The Might of the Thoughts? And in the introduction to that book, a lady by the name of Elizabeth Moosberger says, "This book is dedicated to a human race, a humankind who is ill in its consciousness, so that we can find something called the creational natural way of thinking, which we lost a long time ago." Now, I want to talk briefly again about this idea of clarifying your thoughts, because we need to go back over thoughts, go back over concepts, and repeat things that we've learned before. And what happens is confusion goes away when you do that. That's one of the ways to stop cognitive dissonance. For me, the clarification of my thoughts occurs when I go over things again and again. Clarification means the action of making a statement or situation less confused, more comprehensible. Now, in Billy's book, The Might of the Thoughts, he says our consciousness is like a garden. So we have to maintain our consciousness. We have to reach in there and pull out the weeds that form in our consciousness. These wildly growing thoughts are the weeds which appear in our garden. And these wildly growing thoughts can choke out all of the healthy thoughts. So we need to be like a gardener of our consciousness and pull up the weeds that choke out the positive thoughts. Now, one thing we can fall into is negative repeating thoughts. And the reason, it says in The Might of Thoughts, that psychically disturbed human beings of all kinds only see black in black, and they see negatively, is that their perceptive ability is very limited, whereby the world of thoughts falls prey to that limitation. So our thoughts get into this narrow confines, and we're forced into a cycle where the same bad thoughts appear over and over and over again. So when that happens, take a little time, breathe deeply. That's a good way to get rid of negative energy. 2 or 3 deep breaths, and try to look at this situation in a different way and become neutral and detached, so you can stop the negative repeating thoughts, because the negative repeating thoughts are a lot like cognitive dissonance. And sometimes we have negative repeating thoughts when we have cognitive dissonance in our minds. Remember, cognitive dissonance is when you have 2 ideas that are contradictory, so they're in conflict with each other. Now, there's an interesting writing here that I was sent by a listener, something that Billy wrote a while back. He says, something like a universal evil does not exist, but there exists an energy block around our planet that consists of the religious delusion and nonsense and other negative thoughts emanated by human beings that are thinking along such lines. These people who are living and held in the bondage by belief systems are continually influenced by the negative block of energy, like in a vicious cycle, like these repeating thoughts that we sometimes cannot escape. Entities like the devil, like Satan, like demons are not real, but without exception are just figments of religious delusion and imagination. Breaking the cycle will probably begin about 800 years from now on a larger scale, when people start to occupy themselves with the realization that there is truth, But until the broad masses succeed in profoundly thinking about the truth, much more time will pass. So what's happening is that there's a kind of confusion that is going across the earth right now. A time of confusion and a time of maliciousness. But some of this has been, let's say that we've been controlled by things like television, sports, and news media, which are used to control and manipulate us.
Bringing entertainment to thousands of people. Through its magic, we are able to enjoy a combination of the radio, motion pictures, and the stage, right in the comfort of our own home, simply by pushing a button and turning a dial. These cells with their electrical charges are scanned by a stream of electrons, completing 30 pictures a second. Compare that crude picture with these of today, and you can judge for yourself how far along the road to perfection television has traveled.
Most people still today think that all entertainment to do with movies, drama, is therefore nothing more than their entertainment. It never ever was that case.
Of course, television can't perform such miracles as this, yet. But perhaps there's no harm wishing that it could.
The greatest social messages are promoted through movies and drama, high drama, through the fixation of emotive sequences, emotional sequences, not logical, factual sequences, but pushing points across in an emotional way which register and fix in the mind. So emotional content is very, very important, rather than going through an actual discussion or an argument using logic and facts. There's no debate. And when you're being downloaded through fiction, your guard is down, the sensor part of your brain is not in action. It isn't saying, yes, I agree with this, I disagree with that, as you would in a debate or a lecture. You're actually in an alpha state, being completely downloaded with new ideas.
Throughout history, social engineers have refined techniques designed to control large populations.
About 100 years ago, this big organization with many branches, they wanted to rule the world basically using Britain as a nucleus of a system, an embryo, which also was going to be joined with the US under the Anglo-American establishment, wrote about the kind of culture and the changes of culture over a 100-year period that they would actually design, implement and bring in. And H.G. Wells talked about it too. He talked about arenas. He says arenas could be put up across the world for sports, for instance. Now at that time, sports was something that children, school children were into. Adults became adults and got onto adult things. So it was unimaginable at the time that people could actually believe that there was even a need for adult sports and entertainment, never mind having arenas built across the world. But he said we can do this, and foist basically a sports culture for the males. Using a tribal system, we're all tribal to an extent. That's why we even bother to vote for a tribal leader. This is well understood. That's why we're supplied with these leaders. And because the average man was to become more disengaged from his own destiny as the expert class arose, it was decided that the males would get their outlet basically, gradually becoming helpless as males through sports. Therefore they'd have a tribal team they could identify with, they could cheer them on as they were winning. In their own personal lives they were getting nowhere, they were getting disenfranchised in a sense as experts took over decision making for them in all kinds of fields. So this was psychology at use, planned before they even implemented the sports. When radio came along, of course, they used that to the maximum. Sports for the men, soaps basically for the women, and then in came television, as I say, with its alpha state, its hypnotic state, and Sure enough, around the 1960s, really, 50s and 60s, it took off. It really, really took off. And men became glued on Saturday nights to the sports shows. A culture industry, which is called by its own the culture industry. The Soviet Union had a department called the culture industry. Their actors and directors were called the cultural leaders, because they would, like a computer, people are like computers, all you have to do is keep giving them new updates every so often, and you can change an entire country or a nation or a block of nations who are all getting the same upgrades at the same time along certain paths. Today we call it political correctness. Most people want to belong to their peer group. They want to be the same as everyone else when it comes to opinions. In fact, they judge their own personal sanity by bouncing ideas off their neighbors and friends who will answer back and agree on these same topics in kind. It doesn't matter if the topics or what you're given are facts or utter nonsense, as long as everyone agrees at the same time. You'll say, well, I'm sane, and your friends will all agree because they've had the same information given to them.
But they've been programmed, and I'm sad because I know that it's hard for people like that to take an interest, a serious interest in world affairs, to take a serious interest in what their elected officials are doing. And they're not going to be really inclined to study or discover the deception that's being used against them. And so I'm sad because I see all of that in a flash in my mind as being an indication of how easy it is for the masses to be manipulated.
The scientific dictatorship understands what makes human beings tick. They understand our psychology. They've studied it, and they're using it against us. But the minute the public awakens to the fact that there is an agenda to manipulate them, and the second the public realizes that they are being conditioned and controlled, the establishment begins to lose that edge they've got over people. So all I ask viewers to do is to think for themselves and to study public relations, to study advertising, to study propaganda, and to realize how much of it is out there in their daily lives. And then make the decision for yourself. I just want people to think on their own and to not have their decisions and their thoughts and their ideas pre-packaged and basically downloaded into them.
If it's on TV and a famous face says something, then it must be true. He doesn't have to show you facts or anything else. You've been brought up with these faces. That's why they keep these guys on television into their 70s and 80s. You've grown up with this father figure who's on television every night at 6 o'clock, in your house, in your room, staring right at you, and he's a father figure. Would he tell you a lie? So you naturally never suspect him. And this same man will lead you through new topics. He'll introduce experts on the topics. They'll have a little summary at the end of every talk, and you are now...
So again, other researchers like Alex Jones talking about our consciousness being enslaved, and it was particularly the Roman Catholic Church that inherited the practices of the inhuman Roman Imperium, establishing an evil consciousness conditioned tyranny. So our consciousness is being conditioned. So we got to maintain the neutral, positive thoughts, be aware of all these things happening, start to meditate. I'm going to try to be back later this week. Thanks for joining, folks. You've been listening to Ohio Exopolitics. I'm your host, Mark Snyder.